All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. If you can hear me, please give a thumbs up. So I'm James Benson. I'm a program officer with the National Center for Education Research in the Policy and Systems Division. And welcome to this session that we're holding this afternoon on challenges associated with long-term follow-up studies. I just want to say a little bit briefly about the motivations for the program and the session. It has been very important to us over the last 5 or so years to really be thinking about long-term follow-up studies and where they fit into our broader portfolio of grants that we're funding. And the main reason behind this is because I think all of us share an interest in moving long-term outcomes for students. And so that has been a primary motivator for the program. We have placed these grants in different parts of our programs, but we have maintained them over the last 10 or so years. And there have been several studies that have had a single follow-up as well as 2 follow-up studies. So we've had the chance to follow students for long periods of time. And I do think we're learning some things from these studies, but there are some challenges associated with them that we will address today. And I will just mention one of them, which is just that oftentimes, by the time our researchers are actually conducting the research that is involved in the follow-up study, the systems and practitioners have already given up on the policy program or practice that is being studied. So there is the potential for these projects to be, largely a research exercise as opposed to something that is really informing practice and policy with the intent of improving student outcomes. So with that, I will turn it over to Nikki Edgecombe.
Thanks, James, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I just wanted to say a few words about what brought our team together in this group of panelists together to share out. As James noted, obviously IES has committed and prioritized long-term follow-up analyses. And I think we have wondered within our own body of work. I work at the Community College Research Center, work on a number of R&D centers that are funded by IES, to think a lot about one, what are we learning from the early impacts of studies, and is there enough there to warrant long-term follow-up? Within the post-secondary space in particular, we oftentimes are thinking about meaningful outcomes, which is oftentimes credential attainment. And in our sector, oftentimes those outcomes are measured in 6-year increments. And so whether it's IES or another funder, we rarely have the luxury on the first wave of any particular research project to be able to take a serious look at outcomes like associate degree attainment, or maybe even transfer or baccalaureate attainment. So we were motivated to do this work because it feels important to our space. And as we've assembled a group of folks here today who will talk about their work, and that it does also come with challenges. And so the point James raised is an important one. How do we maintain interest in and enthusiasm about the work, particularly when sometimes our research or policy partners have moved on to other bodies of other reforms or other new approaches. And then there's a lot of sort of tactical and practical considerations that we have to manage, including kind of keeping those partners close and connected to the empiricism, and thinking about ways that we can manage through that as well. So I want to leave most of the time for our presenters to share out. I'm going to ask each of them to be kind enough to introduce themselves at the start of their presentation. And we'll begin with Beth Kopko from my organization, who I'm excited will share some research we're doing jointly with our friends at MDRC.
Thank you, Nikki. Just confirming that my slides are being shown. Yep, great. So my name's Beth Kopko. I'm a senior research associate at the Community College Research Center with Nikki, where I work on the evaluation of alternative placement systems and student outcomes, which was one of 3 original studies comprising CAPR, an R&D Center on Developmental Education, funded by IES. So I skipped, I think. Nope. All right. So CAPR's original evaluation of alternative placement systems kicked off back in 2014 at a time when research was accumulating to suggest that standardized tests used by most institutions to place students were likely not doing the best job at determining which students would benefit or need developmental education and which students would be better off immediately taking college level courses. At that time, the field was increasingly beginning to question whether existing single test-based approaches to placement may have been sacrificing accuracy for the sake of simplicity, and if so, whether better approaches to placing students could lead to increased access to college level courses and thereby or through that better academic outcomes. So we were starting to see some new approaches emerge in the field that were incorporating additional or alternative measures, but few of those systems had been rigorously evaluated at that point. So in response, we proposed and received funding to conduct a 5-year-long study to test the efficacy of one of the alternative placement strategies that colleges were experimenting with, which was the algorithm approach to multiple measures. So in this study, we partnered with 7 community colleges in the State University System of New York to develop and implement college-specific, subject-specific placement algorithms. To do this, we collected historical data from incoming students who both took a placement test and ultimately got placed directly into a college-level course. We then ran a series of models using different combination of available measures from placement test data to high school transcript data, in order to estimate the relationship between those measures and the probability that a student would pass the college level course. And from that series of models, we chose those models that were most predictive to use as placement algorithms at that college. We then implemented an RCT wherein students who took a placement test between fall 2016 and fall 2017 were randomly assigned to be placed by either the status quo system, which is just at the time was just a test-based placement system, or by that newly developed algorithm. Under the original grant, we tracked students for at least 3 terms and then looked at differences in outcomes based on their placement method. The findings from the full sample in the original study showed that in English and to a lesser extent in math, MMA placed more students into college level courses and more students passed those courses as compared to students placed with the single test score. These impacts were also larger and lasted longer for a subset of students whose placements were actually changed by the algorithm, specifically students whose placements were bumped up from developmental level to a college level course were anywhere from 8 to 10 percentage points more likely to pass a college level course. We did not find any impact on student persistence or credential attainment, but as Nikki mentioned, this wasn't necessarily surprising since we were funded to follow students for a relatively short period of time. So around when this original study was winding down in 2019 or so, multiple measures was quickly becoming more popular and more widely adopted. Of course, there were still plenty of unknowns, particularly about whether these impacts would be sustained, and if perhaps MMA might even have an impact on longer term outcomes that we could not observe in that original study. So as the largest RCT on the topic up until that point, and a widely cited study motivating the reform efforts taken up by other institutions around the country, a long-term follow-up study of the same students seemed both appealing and practical. That being said, this subsequent round of long-term follow-up data collection was very unplanned, which meant that we had to go back to some of the things we hadn't thought about for quite some time. And I think there's probably some important lessons that can be drawn from our experiences. So among the hurdles we encountered was first just the act of simply re-engaging SUNY in the newly funded work. While we had strong support from SUNY leadership, who had, of course, signed off on the IES long-term follow-up proposal, SUNY's central data office, which we quickly learned operated largely autonomously, was not particularly enthusiastic about the project, particularly given the extra work it would require of the staff and the fact that COVID-19 had just hit. Moreover, staffing changes in pertinent departments not only meant that we didn't always have the same strong relationships we had relied on during earlier phases of the study, but it also meant that some of our strongest SUNY allies also had weaker connections with personnel that we needed to work with in order to get the project underway. This required additional time spent on relationship building that we had not necessarily anticipated or built into our project timeline. In addition to reestablishing rapport, we also encountered issues related to institutional buy-in. And this relates to something James mentioned during his opening statements. So in the time since the study had been initiated, a lot had changed. First, the algorithms relied, at least in part, on scores from standardized tests that were no longer in use. Meanwhile, the field was increasingly learning more and more about multiple measures, and a set of best practices was emerging. Among these was something actually supported by more recent research being carried out by CCRC and MDRC, which was the idea that simple multiple measures models work just as well as and were probably preferable to more complicated models like the ones that we developed with SUNY. Unsurprisingly, all the colleges in our sample had actually moved on from the original algorithm approach, requiring us to redefend the value of our research and, more importantly, SUNY's continued partnership in that research. Of course, we also had to engage in more formal project management tasks. One of the most labor-intensive of these was establishing a new data sharing agreement with SUNY, who had recently adopted new data security protocols, which we were not previously subject to and therefore unaware of going into the long-term follow-up study. This meant that there was more scrutiny around our data request, which could have threatened our ability to actually track the same outcomes from the original study. Moreover, since the start of CAPR, IES had adopted new data management guidelines that were not part of our prior agreements with SUNY. So these changes on both ends led to negotiations about which data could be shared, by whom and how those data could be accessed, and for what purposes and for how long they could be used. When all was said and done, it actually took us upwards of a year to formally reestablish a relationship or partnership with SUNY on the long-term follow-up study. I'm happy to report, however, that the study eventually did get underway, and we are just now getting ready to publish some of the results from that research. As a preview, we're finding that while the impacts of MMA on English outcomes do decrease over time, they were sustained through all 9 terms. In math, similar to the original study, however, impacts on course completion were limited to that first term. With regard to longer term outcomes, students placed by MMA were taking slightly more college level credits. And although we don't really observe any significant findings on graduation outcomes, persistence, or transfer in the full analytic sample, we are excited about some exploratory analysis, which suggests that students who gain access to college level English through the algorithm may actually have earned associate degrees at a slightly higher rate. So taken together, we have somewhat of a mixed bag of results, which has led our research team to start considering what the consequences of releasing our findings from the long-term follow-up study might be. Specifically, we've discussed whether and how any insignificant impact findings on long-term outcomes might overshadow more promising results on shorter-term outcomes. For example, will the field hyper-focus on graduation rates, even though the main purpose of MMA arguably is to increase access to college-level courses? So I think this is definitely something to consider when weighing whether and how to engage in long-term follow-up research, particularly when we know education impacts tend to fade out over time, particularly when measuring the effects of a one-time standalone intervention like multiple measures. So with that final thought that maybe we'll touch on later in the discussion portion of today, I'll turn it to Chrissy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chrissy Zeiser from American Institutes for Research, and I'm going to talk today about our early college impact study. So our study actually started back in about 2011 with funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The purpose was to evaluate their early college high school initiative. The goal of the ECHSI is to increase the opportunity for students who are traditionally underrepresented in college to earn a post-secondary credential, either getting an associate's degree or earning up to 2 years of college credits during high school at no or low cost to families. In addition to this early access to college, students are provided a rigorous and supportive high school environment. And I really want to emphasize this because a lot of times early colleges and dual enrollment are kind of mixed together as one type of intervention, but really, in addition to being a really intensive dual enrollment opportunity with up to 2 years of college credits, students are supported because the early college high school initiative really focused on students who are traditionally underserved in higher education. There was an acknowledgement that there would need to be supports, both emotionally and academically, as well as those, in order to make sure that students are successfully transitioning out of high school and into either continued education in a 4-year program or into the workforce, instrumental support for students so that they know how to complete a college essay or apply for financial aid as they exit high school. So all of those supports are also included when I'm talking about the early college high schools. The original efficacy study started here in 2010. I joined AIR in 2011 when we were in active data collection for that original study. It's a natural experiment based on retrospective admissions lotteries. And so while the study started in 2010, we actually look at students who entered these schools in grade 9 as early as 2005. And we looked at students who applied to random admissions lotteries entering the 9th grade. We followed 3 cohorts of students for this original efficacy study up to 4 years after expected high school graduation. So depending on the cohort, it was 2 to 4 years after expected high school graduation. And we found generally positive impacts on high school graduation, college enrollment, and early degree attainment, especially for that older cohort who had a little bit more time. We then applied for and were granted an IES efficacy follow-up grant from 2016 to 2019, where we were able to follow all 3 cohorts of students up to 6 years after expected high school graduation. This also had a cost-benefit analysis associated with it. And there we've still continued to find positive impacts on bachelor's degree attainment and associate degree completion up to 6 years after expected high school graduation. I don't have the numbers here, but in terms of the impact on bachelor's degree attainment, it was about a 5 percentage point difference up to 6 years out. And for associate degree completion, I want to say it's like 11 percentage points. So really was not closing that gap in associate degree completion, especially since within our treatment sample, almost a quarter of our treatment sample, which included any students who won the admissions lottery, regardless of whether they actually enrolled in the early college, got an associate's degree during high school. In 2021, we were funded for a second efficacy follow-up study, and I have our research questions here. So now we are following students up to 10 years after expected high school graduation to look at their bachelor's degree completion, as well as the completion of advanced degrees. I have a slide later, but that's largely through the use of National Student Clearinghouse data so that we can identify the degree completion long-term. But we were also interested in these workforce, life, and financial outcomes because ultimately we would hope that the early college high school initiative would achieve the goal of reducing gaps in wages, in salaries, in home ownership, all of those important life outcomes because of the increased access to a college degree for traditionally underserved students. We will also be looking at whether these impacts vary by student background characteristics, as well as updating our cost-benefit analysis with more precise information about the types of careers that our study sample has gone into, now that they're approximately 30 years old. Just a couple of statements about our sample, because we do have a sample of 10 early college high schools across 5 states. As I mentioned, we followed 3 cohorts of students who entered grade 9 between 2005-06 and 2007-08. We have a rather selective sample because in order to be eligible for our study, these early college high schools must have retained their lottery records. They must have had a lottery in the first place, which means they were oversubscribed, and they must have implemented the early college as a whole school program, not a program within a school. So as you can see here, only 10 of the 154 early colleges that were in existence by 2007 qualified for the study, but they continue to be included in our study. I always like, I'm a tables person. I know it's a lot of words on this slide, but just to visualize the progression of our study sample over the 3 phases of our research. We are now in this 2022 to 23 year where we collected outcome data where our study sample was between 12 and 14 years after expected high school graduation. So as I mentioned previously, our primary source for the degree completion data come from the National Student Clearinghouse, which I'm sure many people on this call are familiar with. I personally have loved using the National Student Clearinghouse data because of the ease of use as a researcher. With an NSC account, I can provide the name and birth date of our study sample with permission from the participating districts and states to request data for our entire sample in one shot. It's been very convenient. However, following the theme of today's presentation, we have recently encountered a challenge with this, as data sharing agreements, as Beth was sharing, data sharing agreements do need to be renegotiated at the start of every research study to update the timeline, the scope, the research questions, the funding source, the length of time in which data can be kept, the agreements under which data can be shared. So in updating our data sharing agreements with all of our participating districts and schools, we found that one of the participating districts changed its data sharing policy and said that we had to destroy student date of birth. There were some tears shed. It was very sad that after all of these years of following these students, the district just would not budge. It actually came up when I was in the previous networking session about lawyers' interpretations of laws often have implications for how we can conduct our research, because it was really this one district that was interpreting a law in a way that said that even for research purposes, we could not keep date of birth and use it for the National Student Clearinghouse data collection. And it was kind of ironic because in talking with them, it looks like they had just recently joined the National Student Clearinghouse to get data for their own students and had to cancel and then stop doing that because they couldn't even get the data for their own purposes, which is very unfortunate and maybe will change over time. But in the meantime, we have tried to find other routes for getting those data. And I'm now in communication with the state to try to see if we could potentially identify our sample within the state longitudinal data system and request NSC data through them. It's looking promising, so stay tuned. In terms of our workforce outcomes, we administered a survey, past tense. We actually just received the survey data last week, so I have no results there to share with you. However, I am happy to report that through the NORC at the University of Chicago, we were able to get a response rate of 48% of our original study sample. I am personally thrilled with the 48%, although I know it looks a lot lower than what we would traditionally see in education research. But due to the long time of follow-up, I'll go with the second challenge first. Because of lapses in funding, this was again a study that we were hoping to do a follow-up study, but we didn't know we would have a follow-up study. We did administer a survey as I started AIR in fall 2011. We administered a survey and we had some updated contact information from that point in time, but not for all of the study participants. In fact, our oldest cohort of students was not included in that data collection because we were concerned about asking about their high school experiences after such an extended period of time. So we didn't have updated contact information. Most of our contact information came from the lottery records as far back as 2005. But thankfully, working with NORC, they were able to update the contact information for us, and we're able to get responses from 48% of the study participants. And the other challenge I have listed here is it would have been great to rely on unemployment insurance data. That is a great administrative data source, but working across 5 states with different policies, different data sharing requirements, as well as we don't have social security numbers. A lot of times to access those data, you need to have study participants' social security numbers. That wasn't possible in our case. And so we are still thinking of pursuing this in a couple of states where we may be able to access those data, but we wouldn't be able to get those data for our entire randomized sample. So I think that is where my presentation ends, and I'm happy to pass it to the next presenter.
Hi, everyone. I'm just trying to, there it is, share my screen. Okay. Hi, so I'm Susan Sapanik, and I'm a senior research associate at MDRC, and I'm going to talk for a few minutes today about the Dana Center Math Pathways, or DCMP, long-term follow-up study. So first, what is DCMP? As many of you probably know, a majority of students entering two-year colleges have been required to take developmental math course sequences before being allowed to take credit-bearing courses. Yet the majority of students taking traditional developmental math never complete their developmental math sequence, nor any college level math courses, and this inhibits their ability to earn credentials. Given these problems, reformers, including the Charles A. Dana Center at the University of Texas at Austin, began to rethink how to support students with developmental math needs. The Dana Center designed DCMP with 4 key components. First, it created different math pathways depending on students' planned degree, such as a statistics pathway for students majoring in social sciences or health professions, and a quantitative reasoning pathway for those majoring in humanities or liberal arts. Second, it accelerated the developmental math sequence by requiring all students to take only 1 semester of developmental math, regardless of their math needs, whereas traditional developmental math sequences could require 2 to 3 semesters. Third, the model moved toward contextualized curriculum to engage students in authentic tasks that reflects kind of real life situations. And it also emphasized this student-centered pedagogy. And finally, it included additional supports for students integrated into the course and or aligned with the course, like tutoring and regular check-ins. The original study design was an individual level randomized controlled trial. It was conducted at 4 community colleges across Texas, and it included 4 cohorts of students from 2015 to 2017 with approximately 1,400 participants. And the hypothesis was that DCMP would lead to more students completing developmental math, which in turn would lead to more students completing college level math. And ultimately, this would lead to more students persisting in college and attaining credentials. The original study followed students for 3 semesters after random assignment and found a positive impact on developmental math completion, college level math course taking, and completion of first college math course, and also a small impact on math credit earning. We did not find an impact on overall credits earned during these first 3 months, and we did not look at credential attainment because so few students had completed a credential by the first 3 semesters. But the positive results from the original study led to interest in seeing if the model led to the hypothesized longer-term outcomes of persistence and credential completion. And so we conducted a long-term follow-up study, and I've listed out the findings here from our 3-year brief that we put out last year. We are still finalizing our 5-year analysis, but I can say that the story is similar. We see an impact on students' completion of their first and second college level math courses, but we found no statistically significant impacts on college persistence, total college credit attainment, or credential completion or enrollment at a 4-year college. And so similar to some of the issues discussed by my colleagues, Beth and Chrissy, we have experienced some interesting challenges and opportunities in working through the obstacles of conducting a follow-up study. First, as James alluded to at the beginning of this meeting, DCMP is still being implemented in colleges in Texas and other states, but the current version of DCMP is different from the version we studied. Probably the biggest difference is that DCMP now uses a co-requisite remediation design where students move directly into college level math as opposed to the accelerated developmental version we studied. A recent CUNY study of CUNY students of the co-requisite remediation model in a math pathways format found positive impacts on both associate a very effective change for DCMP. But unfortunately, this study program thus far. This makes it harder for us to promote the relevance of the long-term follow-up findings to policymakers and practitioners who have, in this case, already made some major changes to the model. Another problem with long-term follow-up studies that other folks have discussed is that community college students tend to move around to other institutions. While we can capture degree attainment through National Student Clearinghouse, as Chrissy discussed, other outcomes such as math completion or credits earned were originally collected only from the study colleges. And so we weren't capturing all of the students' credits. But fortunately, we were able to use the Texas Education Research Center data, which includes all colleges across the state of Texas and is allowing us to better capture course taking and credit earning regardless of the college. And few states have robust longitudinal data sets like this, but being able to utilize these data is a real win for our study. And finally, while we had hypothesized that college level math completion would lead to persistence and a degree attainment, it may be unrealistic to expect an intervention early in college would on its own lead to an impact on degree completion and transfer years later. While the CUNY study I discussed earlier is a big exception, many other developmental math reforms have shown similar findings with positive effects on math completion, but little effect on longer term outcomes like college completion. A recent synthesis of rigorous research of post-secondary educational reforms found that most of the effects of interventions occur while the interventions are being provided to students. So we are finding the need that we need to be careful that we don't push policymakers away from what is an effective program in terms of supporting math completion and may be effective as a component in a wider reform that supports students' needs through college. And so I'll conclude and give it over to Mike for the final presentation.
All right, can everyone see my slides? I can't see any of you, so you have to say yes if you can, but I'll just assume yes.
I can.
Someone...
Yes.
Oh, excellent, thank you. All right, so hi, I'm Mike Weiss from MDRC. I'm a senior fellow there. I've been at MDRC for about 15 years now. And I'm coming at this long-term follow-up issue from a slightly different vantage point than the other presenters have. They each focused on sort of individual studies and some of the challenges that occurred when trying to do long-term follow-up. And I've recently been involved in a lot of synthesis work where I've been looking across large bodies of studies and trying to understand what lessons we can learn by looking across them. And some of those then issues that have arisen have to do with when you try to look at long-term follow-up when you're doing these kind of syntheses activities. But in addition to that, as part of this work, my colleagues and I at MDRC have put together this really massive database that I'm going to talk about in a second that raised my awareness of some issues related to long-term follow-up, because in putting together the database, we had to get IRB approval because we're going to make that database publicly available. If anyone wants to get to it, it's on ICPSR. I'll share it on the next slide. But in doing that, the IRB application, we had to gather all the informed consent forms from every single one of the 30 or so studies that are part of it, as well as the data sharing agreements from those studies. It was like 1,200 page IRB application. And so there are some lessons learned for us by having to go through all these past informed consent forms and data sharing agreements that I think can be potentially of interest or value. So let me just tell you a little bit about this database that kind of led to this, some thoughts about long-term follow-up. So it's a database of all of MDRC's higher education RCTs conducted from 2003 when we conducted our first one through 2019. There's around 30 randomized controlled trials in there of 41 different interventions that took place across around 45 colleges, including over 65,000 students. These studies, I think, are pretty high quality. The 27 of the 30 RCTs that have been reviewed by the What-Works Clearinghouse have all met their standards, their highest standards without reservations. The other 3 just haven't been reviewed. But kind of notably, there was longer term follow-up, and by that I mean there was at least looking at 3-year degree completion. Most of these studies took place at community colleges, and so 3-year degree completion is kind of a common time frame to look at. Only 12 of the studies, or 12 of the interventions at least had 3-year degree completion data as part of the follow-up. As you might expect, based on some of the prior discussions of different interventions where there was long-term follow-up, a concern that I had when thinking about doing synthesis and maybe wanting to look at impacts at 3-year degree completion is that most of the other presenters noted that positive early results were part of what led to interest in doing longer term follow-up. And so then a concern is, well, which 12 interventions were the ones that we have this 3-year degree data for? Are they ones kind of that are representative of all the studies that have been done? Or do they tend to be a particular type of intervention or study? And in particular, maybe those that show positive early results. So this is a slide that tries to summarize the answer to that question, which is that yes, we tend to do follow-up for study only in studies where the shorter term results looked promising. So in this sort of figure that you see, we have on the x-axis whether or not the study had the long-term follow-up data, with no being the left-hand column and yes being the right-hand column. And then the y-axis is the impact in percentage points on re-enrollment in semester 2 of the study. And the nice thing about that outcome and time frame is that all of the studies had at least 2 semesters of follow-up. So every single study, we can estimate the impacts of those interventions on that particular outcome. And what you can see is sort of a bunch of dots on the right hand for the yes column that are much, tend to be higher. They have a larger overall average effect of 4.4 percentage points in those studies that had longer term follow-up, and a much smaller effect in those studies that didn't do longer term follow-up, about 1.2 percentage points on average. Each dot represents one study in this graph. And so you can sort of get this sense that whenever you're looking at longer term outcomes, you're probably going to be only including, if you're doing some sort of synthesis or meta-analysis, you're only going to have access to those studies that did that follow-up, and they're going to tend to be, there's going to be this issue of what we call follow-up selection bias. They won't be representative of all studies of a particular type. And so this issue kind of made some of the work that we were doing with these syntheses a bit challenging, and kind of caused us to focus primarily on the shorter term outcomes when looking across studies. But then there was this fun other example that I have of the same type of thing that came from a meta-analysis that was part of the What-Works Clearinghouse Effective Advising Practice Guide that some of you may be familiar with. And I'm just going to highlight sort of one of the recommendations there, which was transform advising to do something, blah, 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 and kind of their summary of findings from that. So they showed that doing this recommendation, the studies that kind of had met their standards for being included in the practice guide, showed an effect on degrees of around 0.29 in effect size units, standardized effect size units, or around 13 percentage point impact. And that came from 5 studies that were sort of part of this broader practice guide that included a total of 10 studies. So again, I sort of wonder, or one might wonder, which 5 studies were the studies that had degree data, because there was 10 studies that sort of met all the other standards for the practice guide. And so here's just sort of a similar graph to the one I showed you before that shows you again that the studies that had longer term follow-up, they're the ones in the yes column. They also, for the larger group of studies, they also looked at shorter term outcomes like progress in college, and that was available for 9 of the 10 studies. So sort of the 4 that, or the 5 that actually had long-term follow-up on degree completion, they had quite a big effect size on progress in college. And the 4 that did not have long-term follow-up, they had a much smaller effect on progress in college, which again was available for them. And so when you think about that impact that I showed you of around 13 percentage points of the effect of this particular practice, I'm guessing it's probably a pretty large overestimate of what we really think, because it's missing these 4 or 5 other studies that, as I'm showing you here, sort of had much smaller impacts on the shorter term outcomes. And if you at least think that the impacts on shorter term outcomes are predictive of what the impacts on longer term outcomes are, there's probably a large upward bias. This is just like kind of a case study of how this issue can arise for this one practice guide, but you can imagine that in any meta-analysis that's going to look at outcomes that kind of take a longer time to occur, or even when you read these kind of follow-up studies of employment and earnings 20 years later, we should probably have some sort of appreciation or acknowledgement of what missing data might, of the issue of missing data and any other studies that probably aren't present of similar or related interventions where we don't have long-term follow-up data because the short-term results aren't available. So that's the main stuff that I actually wanted to say. I think there's some potential hope to do a little better than just present these mean impacts on these longer-term outcomes. If we can develop a better understanding of how shorter-term impacts are predictive of longer-term impacts, it's possible maybe we can use imputation to do a better job of gaining a better understanding of these longer-term impacts by trying to do something about that missing data, at least try to impute what we think it would have been, which probably would be much smaller impacts on these things like degrees. And I'll leave with one sort of last final thought, and this just comes from having looked across those 30 or so studies and all their informed consent forms. And when I say looked across, I mean my colleagues looked across all these informed consent forms and data sharing agreements. It does seem like what has at least been most successful for us when we were able to do long-term follow-up is in those studies where there was an informed consent process, making sure that there was language in there that allowed for this makes it so that you might not have to deal with some of the challenges that were identified by previous presenters. Because if you have consent from the students to get National Student Clearinghouse data, for example, or UI data, you might not have to go back to the colleges and kind of burden them with doing some of the work of getting new data sharing agreements with them. You just sort of might have the permission from the students to do it. And if you've collected their social security number or whatever, it just might make it more doable. And also in looking through these studies, we just saw that our data sharing agreements, some of them were very clear about the length of follow-up, and that made it much easier to do the long-term follow-up. And then other times we weren't quite as clear. So I do think that getting these 2 things kind of right can be super helpful from the outset. But I'll also just acknowledge that a couple of studies that were described earlier were lottery studies or studies that didn't involve active informed consent. And so that sort of takes bullet number 1 here off the table. If you didn't actually do active informed consent, you kind of can't make that happen. So there are designs that kind of make it easier to make long-term follow-up more likely to happen. So I'll stop there.
Okay, Mike. Well, thank you for further complexifying the process of doing meta-analyses and syntheses. I want to encourage participants to drop a question or a comment into the chat if you have one. And do that rather than using the Q&A. It'll just be easier because we'll all be able to see it. I wanted to just follow up on a kind of an observation that Susan made, and Susan, perhaps you can address this in a little further detail. So we do have examples of interventions that show promising short-term impacts, and then they don't necessarily play out in terms of long-term impacts. And so, you know, how do we go about interpreting those situations? And you know, how you mentioned that maybe we would fit something like we would fit something like the Dana Center intervention into, you know, a bundled strategy in the future. But theoretically and practically, how do we go about interpreting the findings and then moving to the next stage in our research?
So yeah, we've been thinking about this a lot because of these findings that we have in this study. I mean, obviously, having stronger impacts in your earlier findings may help to lead to impacts in your later follow-up findings. But that said, having an impact on math completion, which is really the direct goal of the DCMP and of other developmental math reforms, is an important part of the process. And if that doesn't lead to degree completion, that might be a second question. I think one of the aspects to consider is like, well, if you fix that problem, that's obviously this issue of folks not making it through their developmental math courses is obviously an obstacle to graduation. But then for each individual student, is there 2 or 3 other obstacles that they've leaped over this obstacle, but then they have 2 or 3 other obstacles that might be keeping them from graduation? And if that's the case for the wide majority of the students that take developmental math, you're not quite getting them there with this. Even though you're supporting them through this one step, you're not quite getting them there. So that's kind of why we're thinking and recommending that, like, maybe this type of developmental math reform can be considered within a broader scope of supports for students with other obstacles that they might face.
All right. Thank you, Susan. I'm going to jump to a question from Corrine in the chat, and I think this one goes to you, Mike. Are there any published guides for how to design and carry out a longitudinal study to minimize the types of roadblocks that have been mentioned? And I think we're talking here primarily about the data access and the logistical challenges of carrying out a follow-up study.
I don't know the answer to that question. I don't think so. I do. I am hoping to start a project that actually would involve providing some sample language for informed consent forms and data sharing agreements that would be available to other people, so that they could, at least if they're doing those things, they could have a starting point to consider creating those types of documents. But if I can go back to a previous point, because that I have more to say about, what you just asked, Susan, about the kind of fade out issue. I know, like, in the pre-K literature, this is a really popular thing to worry about the fade out of effects, but there's this funny switchery that we've done in some of this conversation, which is like, you have these effects on some short-term outcome, like making it through math or earning credits. And then all of a sudden, if you don't see degree effects, we're calling it fade out, but it's like, that's a different outcome and a different, so I'm not sure if that actually counts as fade out. I would actually argue that, did the effects on math completion dissipate, that might be more of an example of fade out. And at least with this big database of the RCT, we tried to examine this for credit accumulation, and we actually find almost no evidence of fade out, at least after programs end. So in that, we looked across all of these different studies, and I remember 20 something of them had follow-up beyond the end of a program. And we found that any effects that you had in program on credit accumulation, at least, were maintained after the intervention ended. We found really no evidence of fade out, no evidence of growth either. I mean, I think the DREAM program, like, it has effects in program, and then because they've taught you these new skills and whatever else, you see impacts on credits even growing afterwards. We saw no evidence of that, but we also didn't find any evidence across the studies of impacts on at least credit accumulation fading. It doesn't mean it always translates to graduation effects, but I don't know that that's as big of an issue in post-secondary.
Thanks, Mike. yes, the perennial challenge of moving the dial on degree attainment in post-secondary education. Chris has an interesting question on the difference in statistical power across initial efficacy studies and follow-up studies, and raises the possibility that perhaps the follow-up studies are not adequately powered to detect meaningful but smaller effects on longer-term outcomes. So is there anybody that would like to address that design issue? Or it's really a design challenge because you're locked in once you've done the initial efficacy study.
Yeah, I can speak to that because I know, especially as if you're starting a longitudinal study now, I feel like I am in the recruitment phase for some studies, and I feel like it's so much harder now than it was 13 years ago when we were doing the original efficacy study. And so I think we are hoping to plan for the short-term power needs rather than trying to get a larger, I mean, we'll take whatever sample we can get, but I don't know that we can aim so high as to aim for those longer-term outcomes. But I think you raise a valid point because we do have some of our longer-term degree attainment outcomes for the early college study, and we are seeing this fading of our bachelor's degree attainment impact is no longer significant after 10 years. Although I think it is still meaningful that they're earning those degrees earlier in their lives. But it's still a positive impact. It's no longer significant, but it's still 2 or 3 percentage points. So is that not meaningful anymore? And so I think you raise a valid point that the lack of significance over time may actually be due to some of that, the smaller effects not being statistically significant.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I think you're also raising, an organizational point that occasionally verges on the political, which is that it is difficult to recruit sample. And what you're suggesting is it's becoming increasingly difficult in the post-pandemic period. And I wonder if anybody has any ideas about big picture, what needs to happen in order to incentivize recruitment and to increase buy-in, for the initial efficacy studies that provide the groundwork for the long-term follow-ups that we're talking about. Okay, we're all silent. I will say, kind of tongue in cheek here, that one of my big priorities as a program officer is recruitment. And you've just given me a new argument for why recruitment is extra important, because generally I say it's important because we have to be able to do subgroup analysis in the initial efficacy study. Now I see the importance of having some extra power to work with when it comes to the follow-up study. I want to circle back to something that I think got kind of lost in Susan's presentation because she, she faded out in the audio, and I know Lexa Logue is here with us, so I'm wondering, Lexa, do you want to say a little bit about the long-term impacts of the CUNY math co-requisite study? You're muted.
Yes.
There we
I'm
go.
just getting on video. Sure. I think one thing that, we've been hearing a lot of comments about, well, your study's unusual because you had long-term effects and you're the only one. And the thing is, there's more than one thing that's different about us than that we're the only one that had long-term effects. So one thing that's different is that ours was done truly an experiment where everybody was exposed to what they were supposed to be exposed to, whereas many of the other studies are quasi-experimental ones following policy changes when the implementation of the intervention was not consistent or didn't exist at all in every case. So that is very different from our sort of situation. Another thing is that I think a lot of these studies haven't looked at long-term consequences. You know, some of them have looked and not found, and it's faded, but others, just many, have not looked at all. So we shouldn't confuse a lack of long-term finding with a fade out of finding. I also think it's interesting what the point that Mike was making about the power situation, in that because ours was done the way it was, we had everybody who was in the initial study was in the long-term follow-up, and there was nobody missing. So we had the same power that we had at the beginning, we had at 7 years. So that was also different. So I think there are a number of differences. And I guess one final point I'll make is that ours was about math, and a lot of the remediation studies have been about reading and writing. And I think there's pretty much general feeling that remedial math has been a bigger block to student success than have the reading and writing. So if what you're doing is removing a bigger block as opposed to a smaller block, then hopefully you're going to have more long-term effects.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Lexa. Very important and pivotal study there on co-requisites at CUNY. I want to just turn to the bigger picture here a little bit before we follow up. Nikki has offered an observation that perhaps, you know, we need to think more about relationship building and compensation as relates to recruitment. And so, you know, Nikki, do you want to follow up on that and say a little bit more about that? We're about 3 minutes from time at this point.
I think it's pretty self-explanatory. I just think we're all under the rush of maybe a 3 or a 4 year time frame, which makes these really pivotal relationship building elements less of a focus. So how can IES think about whether it's a year of planning dollars or other things that allow research teams to spend more time on this, which could hopefully facilitate some better recruitment processes later on as the relationship gets deeper.
Right. And you know, what if the grant though was the grant for subsequent years was conditional upon building and securing access to the data in the planning year?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fine. I'm just sort of recognizing in our current environment that takes a long time. You know, data agreements are taking us a year to negotiate now. And so that's important. If that is in fact relatively consistent, that would shape a different timeline for the research. Right.
Yeah, I was just kind of going back to some of the comments from our director, you know, about building in different stages of research projects, and wondering though if there is a benefit to being able to go to the partner and saying, you know, if you can do this with us, then, you know, we can get subsequent funding. If on the other hand, there's more of a benefit to saying, you know what, we have funding to do this project, we just need to make sure you're on board. But I would echo your observation that I am seeing grantees take much longer than it used to take to, you know, to finalize data use and data sharing agreements. And that is a challenge. We've also had some challenges in terms of finalizing the IRB approvals because of the common rule. Yeah, and Corinne is mentioning that she's seeing some of the same challenges in the K-12 space. So this is a discussion that we need to continue. Chris, I know you had a question, and I'm going to encourage you to speak with Mike about challenges and solutions for consent forms and the like. So with that said, we want to stick to our timeline, and it is 5:30 in the afternoon here on the East Coast. So I want to say thank you to everybody for being with us this afternoon. I think this has been a great set of presentations and a nice discussion. I hope you all have a good evening.